and thanking you for tuning in on your side as well to the very first episode of this podcast that I have chosen to call as simple as possible Ayurveda and Psychology. And I've chosen those two words to, well, basically say what you see is what you get, because those are the two themes that we're going to discover during the episodes. And it's also, I would say, the two themes that have been very present throughout my life, but very much so today as well. They have been present throughout my life without sometimes me knowing that you would relate back to these two words. And I have a sneaky feeling that if you tune into this episode, that these two words have triggered something of interest in you, maybe you are the same. So where I am today with these two themes is obviously really different to where I was at back in a time when I really needed much more of this. And that's where the journey begins. I wanted to take the first episode of this podcast to really introduce myself. I want to introduce myself and the journey that I've been on and am on, and the struggles that I've had, as a way to also reassure anyone out there who might feel very far from where they want to be. And we can easily get into this idea that what we see on an Instagram post or whatever is everything about a person. And let me confirm that that is of course not the case. And in order to be maybe where I am today, with certain of the themes where I feel that I've evolved into, is really far from where I was, just 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So I guess it's also a way to bring another perspective onto who I am, and therefore hear what I have to say in a different way for you as well, maybe more relatable. And some of you know me already, maybe even personally, I hope so. And some of you know a little bit about what I'm doing because you're following me on social media. And so I just wish to really confirm that the yoga teacher / Ayurvedic practitioner living on the tropical island of Bali, teaching here and speaking and doing stuff, having coconuts on the beach and driving around on my scooter bike, is not who I was then, years ago. And I was far from it, and I was living a very different kind of life as well. And I believe I needed to go through each and one of the struggles, the obstacles, the heartbreaks and frustrations that I've been on my whole life in order to be where I am today. And hopefully the things that I'm struggling with today are also necessary for me to evolve into what I will be tomorrow and another time. So simply to start, when I was around 16, in what would be similar to, I suppose, high school for the Anglo-Saxons, we had the opportunity in school to take a few classes of general knowledge in psychology. More or less, it meant, who is Sigmund Freud? What's the unconscious? What's the ego, the superego, and the id, or the it? It was more or less around that. And I fell madly in love with this subject because I have, since my whole life, without knowing it actually then, had this one drive, which is to understand my own mind, I really think. It was to understand why we do the things we do, really. But it was really a question of understanding my mind, because I think I was intrigued with this experience that I was having and the thoughts. So I got deeply interested in this subject, which led me to study clinical psychology, other psychologies as well, but very much the clinical side, and psychoanalysis later on when I went to university and when I was living in another country. I left Sweden to travel around in the world a little bit, or well, Southeast Asia actually, when I was around 20, 21 years old. And that was also the first time I came to Bali and fell in love with this very exotic and such a contrast place to, well, the Scandinavian cold, very squared maybe, country of Sweden, where I had lived my whole life up until then. I traveled around for a few months in Southeast Asia that year, and it changed me forever because I was stuck with this really strong desire to experience again whatever it was that I was experiencing emotionally and spiritually, I suppose, while I was on this journey. Spiritually, don't get me wrong, I wasn't aware that it was spiritually, and I wasn't visiting temples and being, all yogic and everything back then, because actually it was absolutely less trendy. So it was not something that I was into or even knew really anything about. But spiritual in the sense that it was this freedom, the sense of freedom from the known which was the person that I thought that I was and that I was supposed to be, that I was limited to being. And all of a sudden it was this opening to all possibilities, actually, to a different perspective on life, to a different life in itself, and just maybe imagining that there was something else out there. And anyway, this experience as a 21-year-old, I was actually more 20 because I'm born at the end of the year, and this was started in January, actually, or February, led me to then moving to France from Sweden, the south of France, and living there for, well, a big part of my adult life, 15 years actually. So that would actually have formed me maybe even more than my upbringing in Sweden in certain ways. So living in the south of France and studying psychology, I got more and more into the clinical side and psychoanalysis. For different reasons, I then went into another field, which was actually human resources, when I actually started to work after my university studies. And I guess I needed for that to happen for two reasons. Number one was that I was far too young to be treating people with their life crises or issues from childhood at the age of merely 25. Having not really experienced much myself yet, and not knowing myself either. And the second reason was that I probably needed to go into the field that I did so that I would come to the point that I did a few years later of wanting to just change my life completely. Because anyone who goes into the field of psychology, kind of like anyone who decides to really enroll in the path of yoga and also Ayurveda, does so for a reason. And it starts with a very personal reason. And even if it's to then use this as a way to make a living in life, you don't get there just by hazard. Or like the French would say, you don't go there just because you see that the light is on. So later on, after having worked then in something much less juicy, which is the human resources field, administration, and more so recruitment, and being a headhunter for a big international group, where I had to actually work a lot on sales more than anything else, I came to a point where nothing in my life corresponded to who I truly was and what I wanted. And this means that I simply felt as if I've lost touch with life. And it's a place where a lot of people come. And most of the time what happens is that we don't know what is wrong. We just know that we are unhappy. We might feel depressed. We feel disconnected. We feel a loss of sense of purpose. And the reason for this is that we have very early on disconnected from our true sense of feeling ourselves into life. Or shall I say, we've disconnected from our internal GPS, the guiding system, which is our emotions. And we come to that point, so we feel disconnected, we feel not really knowing what's our purpose in life. And the journey into finding the purpose is actually backwards, because we need to reconnect again to what our feelings are saying. We need to learn to trust them. And that will be the theme or the subject of a whole episode itself when I go into the psychology. So I'm not going to continue on that straight away now. But what happened was that I basically broke free from most of what structured my life in that time. And now this did not happen over, a night like that. So the reflection on it started at one point, and then the different changes happened actually over the course of, at least 2 years, the big changes. So even if you're somewhere on that journey right now, rest assured that for me either, it was not something that happened, over a week, and then all of a sudden I was living in the tropics, sipping coconut water, looking out over the ocean the week after. Absolutely not. And even I think that maybe there was some ideas in the back of my mind of what I wanted this to look like one day, but they were not clear, and it was probably more the seeking back to that emotional state, that kind of spirituality that I experienced when I was traveling my first time out in Asia, that I was seeking. I was seeking more that feeling state than anything else. And if you don't know what that means, if you don't know that this is what you're actually seeking, then all you know is that you are longing for something that isn't there, and you are suffering from the gap of where you are at now and this, whatever it might look like, you're seeking. So I went through several changes that started with feeling unhappy, going through some rather painful physical experiences of womanhood and feeling of maybe lack of womanhood, because I experienced several miscarriages and these things we call the ectopic pregnancies, where there's a fertilized egg in the tube, but it doesn't go down into the womb, and it actually can be really quite dangerous. Today we discover these things very early on, so it's not really that bad anymore. But for instance, my mother went through it as well before my birth. And so back in those days, they didn't discover it early enough, and it would actually even lead to death for the mother, actually. Sometimes. Obviously not mine then, she's still alive. Now, I went through some very strong physical then manifestations that something was wrong, and that led me up to breaking off the relationship that I was in after almost 8 years being with that person and engaged to be married since a year. And I broke off the engagement 6 months before the wedding. Whenever I say that to someone, everyone just gasps. But let me reassure you, it was not like in the American movies. It was not well planned and everything, and the invitations had been sent out and all of that. So it was well before anything really had been planned, and we had just found the place and the venue, and we managed to not get the deposit back, but at least stop all of that. So it was dramatic, but it wasn't as dramatic as in your Hollywood scenario. However, little by little I started changing things. So it started with that, and I can tell you that I did not feel as if I was going towards something positive. I was feeling really miserable as I was going through this. And about a year in after that happened, I started going into therapy with a Jungian analyst. And the reason I did that was not because I was so self-aware about what I needed, but more because the people around me started saying that we can't stand you anymore and you need to go and see someone professional. So I did that, and I did that for about a year. And whether the therapy did it or something else, I evolved into understanding more about what I needed, and then leaving the job that I had, moving away from the city, and finally getting my certification as a yoga teacher. And while I was studying yoga, I realized that there was a connection to my first love, that was the clinical psychology, but just from a different perspective, which was very interesting to me as well. And I had not understood back then the psychological impact that yoga has on someone, the continuous practice, the regular practice of yoga. And I started to see just a little bit of that, but it was just opening a little bit the door towards something very different. And I heard of Ayurveda in my training because I have a traditional kind of training in yoga, which means that it's classical yoga that is also often called just Hatha yoga, even though it's all Hatha yoga really of the asana practice, which means that the traditional yoga actually is the sister science to Ayurveda. So yogis would simply live the Ayurvedic way of life and implement the Ayurvedic principles in their way of living, which is exactly what we were taught to do, and therefore taught also the Ayurvedic principles to a certain extent in that training. And it was the very first time that Ayurveda actually made complete transformation to me. But I did not realize it then. I actually had to go through Ayurveda changes 3 times before I understood that it actually was doing something really good to me. Now, I will also dedicate an episode to that part, so I'm not going to go further into detail about what it did to me, but it did make a huge change for me. And as I left the ashram where I did my training and went back to my more normal way of living, which has already changed, of course, from what I had before when I was living in the corporate world and having a different kind of lifestyle altogether, I still went back to something quasi-normal from before, and of course losing all the benefits that the time in the ashram had brought me. Because that's the thing as well, if we don't actually use this in a conscious way, what we learn through yoga and through Ayurveda, and implement it on a daily basis with the regularity, then we will lose it. Because as we go back to our old habits, which is something that is just normal for our brain, we will also go back to what we've always known as familiar. And it took me a long time to realize this, and it's something that I'm still understanding, because let me confirm as well that it is not something that I'm always consistent with even today. I think it's a lifelong journey to fall back again into old habits, realizing that we've done so, and then kick ourselves in the butt and make our way back again to what we're learning. Anyway, I was living out on the coast of France in Biarritz, which is one of the most beautiful places that I have been to and lived in, for sure, when it comes to Europe. And also for me in my life, definitely one of my absolute favorite places that I've lived in. And would it not have been for instance, the heartbreak that I went through while I was there, I would maybe not have ended up in Bali about 2 years after moving out there. So in the end, that heartache that happened while I moved to Biarritz, which was a different kind to the giving up on the engagement, so a different person, different relationship, actually led me to something else as well. And that's, not something we see, of course, in the moment, but in hindsight, we realize that everything happens for a reason. And as I moved finally to Bali, I had been to India for a little bit in between and discovered the practice of Ashtanga, which comes from the city of Mysore, just south of Bangalore. And the only reason I actually really discovered that was because I wanted to go to India, and a good friend, my best friend at the time, told me go to Bangalore because I have connections in Bangalore and I rather have you going on your own, single white female, to India, to a place where there's people who are expecting you. Because there's also other places in India that I wanted to visit, but there had been back then as well, quite recently, some unfortunate events, so it was a little bit scary. So I ended up going to Bangalore simply due to my friends' connections, and that was wonderful because I was taken care of by some wonderful people in Bangalore first, and then decided to move down to Mysore after a week. And in Mysore, I learned Ashtanga, and I learned it the traditional way, which is what's called Mysore style. So it's not in the lead classes, and it is in a very specific and interesting way of learning it, which I also will go into another time. Basically, you learn slowly and implementing day by day new poses, new asanas into your practice. When I finally arrived in Bali in the end, deciding to move here, I had made the encounter. I had met up with a studio that actually functioned just like the yogis in Mysore. And so naturally, I was drawn to functioning the same way as them. So I arrived in Canggu, Bali. That was a place very different to what it is today. It was mainly rice fields, some small varungs, which is the name of the local food places, basically, or cafes, if you will, to use a Western way of looking at it, local ways, and a few of those Western places, so you could get your fancy Western coffees, for instance. And there was this yoga studio that then used the ancient way of doing things, let's say, of the Mysore style of Ashtanga yoga. And I started practicing with them, and I started working with them more specifically. And over that time, I was, like anyone who's been living in Bali for a while can probably testify as well, experiencing the adjustment physically that moving from the cold climate to a tropical climate has. So over a couple of years, I would go through these weird things, especially when we went into rainy season, because it got hotter and more humid. And so you would experience issues with the body one way or another. You would easily become sick in one way or another. And it was one of these times where I really developed a strange thing that we still don't really know what it was. But I was basically overheating, and I tried different things and it didn't help, and it actually got worse. And finally, I went to see an Ayurvedic doctor here in Bali, in Ubud, at the Ayurvedic clinic in Ubud, who explained to me that I was a very Pitta person, which is the fire element, and that I had also triggered my Pitta very much, which was why I was experiencing all of the things that I was going through. And by just simply implementing the tools that he gave me, and also the herbs that he gave me, and changing my way of eating and living, I was not allowed to do all of those things that I love doing, of running, for instance, that I did every day, and practicing my Ashtanga yoga that I did as well, more or less every day. I had to basically be perfectly still for a while. And about a month after starting this, maybe a little bit longer, I was much better. It disappeared. I was healed. Healed, and also experiencing certain things that I felt like I'd never experienced before. Not only was I healed from the issues that I've had, but I was also feeling much better, much more grounded. My body felt so good, and it looked so good in a way that I have thought my whole life was not accessible to me, unless I would starve myself and over-exercise, for instance. Once again, I did not really understand what I needed to do, i.e. being regular in this. But then after some time, I can't remember now how much time, I kind of went back again to the normal me. Just having my normal ways of being, of kind of being in and out of balance. When it came to physically, the way I ate, the way I felt, And I would have to experience a healing moment again a few years later, when once again I was very out of whack, let's say, not at all as bad as that first time in Bali, but really feeling out of whack. And that was after a trip I'd taken to India again. I went back to see my teacher in India for my Mysore practice, but it was much more intense this time. And so when I came back after having spent a month with him, I was very fragile, and I was not feeling good at all. Not the way you'd think you would feel, actually. And once again, the doctor told me that I had overstimulated basically my nervous system, if you want to speak in Western terms. I was out of balance for both my Vata and my Pitta, and I was not feeling well. And I had to once again work my way back to balance using the Ayurvedic principle, and this time in a way that was more conscious of me, because I understood more of it as well. Finally, the one time that I really became conscious was when I then decided to study Ayurveda, to become an Ayurvedic practitioner. And I studied again with my teacher, who had certified me as a yoga teacher originally, and it was when I really gained all this understanding on a much deeper level, because there's so many layers to Ayurveda, that I understood just how wrong I have used the principles maybe as well before. And it's from that point, which was actually then during this whole pandemic as well, so I took the advantage of using that to train myself in this, that I changed so much more. And the thing is, what I realized with all of this is that sometimes we have to be told things several times in different ways, and it's still not going to be integrated, because it also depends on where we are at with ourselves. And you know this, there's things that have been exposed to you many times, and then all of a sudden it will actually speak to you and you will take it in. And it depends on where you're at with yourself in this, because everything needs to be very personal for us to really take it to ourselves. Now, what's so fascinating with both yoga and Ayurveda is that even if on a surface level it seems as if we are dealing with physical things, the body, the nutrition, the routines, it is the holistic perspective, which means that it will automatically play in or play on to what's happening in the mind as well. And so, for instance, as you practice yoga and you do this regularly and it becomes your routine, you will begin to notice subtle changes every day. You will become more aware about or of how you feel different from one day to the next. And you will notice as well that from 1 month to the next, or from 1 year to the next, you will evolve in how you deal with yourself while you're in your practice, while you're on your mat. And it begins then to show to you, as if there's a writing on the wall that you need to become aware of, what your habits and your patterns of behavior are. And you see, just like in psychology, you have to become aware, so you have to shine the light of awareness, as they say, onto these things in order to be able to do something about them. And this is where I want to tie the knot with the psychological practice or the therapeutical situation, because that is actually what therapy really is about. It is to bring to the surface the things that you are not aware of, but that you keep doing, so that you can deal with them, which is why they tend to become darker before you resolve them. Because things need to come up to the surface. You need to be acutely aware of something before you can actually resolve it and then let it go. And it's when you start to accept it and when you start to deal with it, when you actually destigmatize, let's say, the meaning that you make of something on an unconscious level, that's when it loses its power over you. And what's more interesting in itself as well is how all these aspects play together. Because the thing is, from the Eastern perspective of Ayurveda and from the perspective of yoga, we deal with the psyche in a specific way. And it's in a certain way very simplified compared to what we're used to as Westerners, which is very good, and it's very healing actually to deal with things in a very simplified way. But it also misses out a little bit on certain points, since this is coming from a perspective of thousands of years ago, where civilization looked maybe a little bit different to what it does today, but more so, there's a lot of issues that we have today that is so much linked to shaming of who we are. And I feel that Ayurveda and yoga can be such a healing process for us, but we don't let ourselves access them very often simply due to this shame that we have deeply rooted inside of us. The self-help, the level of self-hate that we find in the world today, and that was a very Western thing, but actually I think probably today is everywhere. The level of self-hate that was very problematic from the West can be healed for sure through these ancient practices, but I feel that we are not allowing ourselves to even try often due to the self-hate. And what does that look like? It looks like spiritual bypassing, actually. So very often we're here with our shame and everything that transforms into, because rest assured, many of the things that you do out of shame, you are not aware that it's actually shame driving you. And we have this idea that we need to be these spiritual people, these happy, these balanced people. And so we look into yoga, we look to Ayurveda and other practices, and we just want to be there. And so then we just feel like we should adopt certain ways of being, which means that we are putting on new layers. So we're just changing one mask actually for another. And this is what the spiritual bypassing does to us, which means that the shadow side to this becomes even darker, actually. The more we try to shine in the persona, in the side that everyone else is seeing, by pushing away the darkness, the darker the shadow becomes. And the thing is, the shadow, the darker it is, the more it actually has power over us. So I guess that this is one of the beautiful ways that the therapeutical tool of the West can come in and complete the holistic perspective from the East, which is really what I'm hoping to give to you through this. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to this podcast and this episode. I am very grateful. If you enjoyed this and you think that other people could enjoy this, please help me to spread the word. Share this episode on any channel that you have of social media or messaging. And even more so, I would really appreciate if you know one other person who might benefit from my words today specifically. Take that 1 minute it takes to simply share this episode with one person. Remember that there's a human being on the other side of your phone, of your earpods, of this microphone. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what I've been talking about. So please leave a comment. Send me a message directly if you wish. This is Charlotte. This is me. See you next time. Namaste.